Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk about something that I've not talked about too often on this channel, and that is the LGB in the LGBTQIA plus acronym, which is kind of ironic because I've talked a lot about trans issues and I've talked back and forth about those sorts of things. However, I've not really talked too much about the idea of sexuality, and specifically being gay, lesbian, bisexual. So, full disclosure, I myself am pansexual and I am demi-romantic. So, let's just kind of break it down for a second. Traditionally, in America, if you're growing up, all the media that you've seen and probably the way that your parents communicated to you, that sort of thing, is that being homosexual is a negative, which there's honestly nothing wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's all right. So they'll say that like two men being together is, you shouldn't, that's bad. You shouldn't do that, whatever. Generally, typically religious reasons. I've heard some secular reasons, but we'll get into this in just a second. Then there's, lesbians. If you're two women that are attracted to each other, that's also somehow a negative. So most people understand their sexuality as they're kind of like indoctrinated to be heterosexual. So if you're a correlated male at birth or an AMAB person, you're pressured to find a girl and hook up with her and have a family, have babies. And if you are on the other side of that spectrum, if you're a AFAB person, you're told that you're supposed to essentially cater the children into the world, carry them, etc. And you have motherly duties and all that sort of stuff. There's a whole patriarchal structure that goes along with this. That basically is, there's a father and he's a provider, and there's a mother and she's in charge of the household while he works, etc. Everyone is hopefully probably aware that there's this dynamic going on in American families, if you are in America, and I think it's pretty common across the world. Non-traditional families. First of all, AMAB doesn't mean anything. That does not mean that you're a man. You could easily be trans, non-binary, etc. In this channel before, I've not done necessarily the best job pointing out that there are non-binary people, etc., especially considering that my spouse is non-binary. So I'm trying to do better in that. Lesbians, same thing. Just because you're AFAB at birth does not necessarily mean anything toward your sexuality. Sexuality and gender, while they're related to each other, they're like, it's like different parts of a yin and yang type of thing, where just because you understand your gender or gender identity expression in a certain way, that does not necessarily mean that your sexuality is going to express anything close to that. So let's kind of get into some of the common misconceptions that people have had about sexuality and in general. And that would be for instance, they'll say, can a man, an AMAB person, be straight if he's accepted blowjobs or something of the such from other men? Can he still identify as straight? Could he be a straight man that is having sexual relations with other men? Surprisingly, at least to some people, the answer is yes. Yeah, you can be straight, 100% heterosexual, and still accept sexual favors from the same gender as you. Because, and this is where people start getting their feathers ruffled a little bit. So the reason why is because sexual acts, individual sexual acts, don't define your sexuality. So there's very common for people during their teens or maybe even college years to kind of experiment around, play around a little bit. There's nothing that says that just because a man has accepted a sexual favor from another man, that automatically makes him gay. It just doesn't. You could continue to have sex with other men and still not be gay. It's possible. Or at least identify that way. And now, other people might look at that and say, well, he seems kind of confused, or I'm not sure if he knows what he really wants. That might be the case, but he could still identify as heterosexual and it would still be true. as far as his identity, because no one else can define you. And that's why, just for instance, I'm sure you'll agree with us, there are plenty of closeted gay men that are in heterosexual marriages. So then later on, when they suddenly get divorced, or their wife finds out that they're cheating on them with men, it surprises them. They're like, I can't believe this happened. Nobody ever saw this coming. And it's like, look, it's the fact of the matter is, he could have been, bisexual, gay, whatever, etc., etc. But that's not necessarily the case. He could also just be a heterosexual man that just accepted sexual favors from other men, but that doesn't change his personal identity as far as his sexuality goes. So I just want to make that very clear, that just because someone is a fab, a mab, etc., that does not define their sexuality. Their sexuality could be defined totally different than how they are expressing themselves. So most people understand heterosexuality perfectly fine, because that's what people are indoctrinated to understand, especially religiously, when a lot of religions can continue to perpetuate this patriarchal order, where they say like a man is the head of the household, he should produce children, the woman should like bear those children, bear whatever. So there's a lot of pressure for these things to happen within our society. What happens a lot, though, is that during the teenage years and going into college, a lot of people experiment around a little bit and to say like, oh, I've always been interested a little bit in to find out like what it's like with another woman, or maybe with a man for the first time, etc. Now, that's where explorations of homosexuality end up at. Most people start off with a rough conception of heterosexuality because that's what they were raised in, or that they have been indoctrinated in by society. And then some of these people end up recognizing that there might be like bisexuals, where you could be someone who is attracted to, both, either, male men or women. And it doesn't really matter to you necessarily what like components they have. That it gets trickier when you start asking them about trans people or non-binary, etc., because a lot of people that would consider themselves like fairly open as far as their sexuality goes with dating men or women, they are pretty certain that men or women only. Now, we can further complicate this whenever they start recognizing that it might not necessarily truly be the idea of just a man or a woman that they're attracted to. It was the idea of masculinity and femininity that they're attracted to, which then ends up leading to the case where they could easily expand their sexual preference to include like trans people, non-binary people, etc., the full spectrum. And that's really how I kind of view sexuality, which is the way that it seems like it is going, and our modern understanding of sexuality. It is a spectrum, just like gender, etc., because there's like so many waves along sexuality, and then all these different people are plotted at different points and how they understand themselves, their sexuality. That doesn't seem like there's a very good categories that define these things for everyone. For some people, these categories are always going to be kind of like blurred together, or might be completely divided off. Like if you have someone who's truly heterosexual and just will not experience any type of sexual attraction for somebody with like their same, we'll say, the same gender stereotypes correlated at birth. You also have people that have genital preferences, very strong genital preferences. Like for whatever reason, they're just very sexually attracted to vaginas, or they're very sexually attracted to penises. And that's just their thing. That, like, if you don't have a penis or you don't have a vagina, they're just not interested. There's nothing wrong with genital preferences, except from the case where you try and disqualify someone else's identity and like their gender identity for not having the right equipment. That's bullshit. So you could say like, oh, I have a preference for vaginas. And then you could argue that, oh, well, I have a preference for people that were born with vaginas, or whatever else. You could just say like, oh, if you're a trans woman, you don't necessarily, I don't necessarily have a preference because if you have a penis. That's understandable. It gets a little iffy once you start saying that even if a trans woman has a vagina, you would still not date them. That's when it's like, you should probably question that. Just like if you had a buddy of yours that said, oh, I'm attracted to all sorts of men except for white men, just not them, everyone else, just not white men, you'd be like, I don't know, maybe you should, what's wrong with whitey, Anyway, on top of all these different understandings of sexual preferences, which might change throughout somebody's life, you also end up with how, like, what their libido is. So they might be hypersexual, they might be asexual, they might be like somewhere on the gray spectrum where they're not asexual, but they're like me, or they're demisexual or something. So they have to feel like they have a connection with a person as far as like their personality before they could be sexually attracted to them, which is typically like where like I land at. And then you could have somebody who's like, like I said, a hypersexual who just is okay with like having sex with whoever and whenever, and they just kind of do whatever they want to. You can have people that are pansexual. They're just they have no genital preference, no nothing. They care more about the person than their physical configuration. There's the gamut of everything, including people, as we discussed earlier, genital preferences. So people that are truly straight, or I would say, or they have some general preference opposite of theirs, or homosexual who has a preference to a set of genitals like their own, and that can include lesbians. So that's pansexual, ace, gay, lesbian, bi. I think that's pretty much it, well-rounded as far as sexuality goes. We understand that people explore this throughout their life. Just because somebody did identify as straight at one point does not mean that they might broaden that to bisexual or expand it to pansexual. You also have the different libidos, where somebody might care very little for sex but still want the companionship, and you have someone else that cares, like hypersexual. They really care about sex. They want to have a lot of sex. All of these things are different for different people. Obviously, certain religions like Christianity have stigmatized sexuality, like period, unless it perpetuates the patriarchal, hierarchical structure that has been put in place over time. If you're not, one man, one woman, etc., which is ironic considering the Christian Bible and the Old Testament contains many kings that had thousands of wives and harems and all of this type of stuff. But they won't say like the modern ideation only as the Old Testament. Yet when you look at their role model, which is Jesus, he supposedly didn't have a wife, didn't have kids. So it's like, well, it's weird that you picked somebody who's very clearly asexual as your motto for how you're supposed to live the perfect life, although y'all are not asexual. It's fine. And then religious people also try to guilt you that, it's wrong, and it's not. Like, there's nothing wrong with exploring your sexuality. There's nothing wrong with enjoying sex. Just make sure that you take the appropriate precautions, whether that is using some kind of contraceptive, or, being in a safe place, etc. And I think, so the religious side just boils down to plain old bigotry. There's no compelling religious argument why you should not explore same-sex relations or, sex outside of marriage, however you want to. There's nothing that says if you have sex outside of marriage that you're going to have problems. There's also nothing saying that, it's going to ruin your marriage later on if you have sex before your marriage and then you get married. There's nothing wrong with that either. Religious arguments just fall flat on their face. I think that pretty much covers it for my initial thoughts on sexuality. I know that I've talked a lot about gender issues, so I figured this time I would kind of like tackle some of the other areas of the LGBT. There's very large LGBT communities around the world. There's tons of media for us now. There's lots of wonderful communities that you can get a hold of if you look at like Reddit threads, or you look up LGBT, the hashtag on Twitter. You can find plenty of gay and lesbians to get in contact with. There's nothing wrong with being you, and there's nothing wrong with your sexuality. Don't let anyone tell you that you ought to be ashamed for being who you are. You are wonderful. You are lovely. and however you want to express yourself is perfectly fine. And you will always have an LGBT community here on social media or in real life if you can find like local communities, local meetup groups, etc. There are plenty of us out here that will support you. You do not have to live in some closet for the rest of your life. It is okay to be you. You do not deserve the type of trauma that causes from staying closeted your entire life. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe. If you haven't, check out my old content, and I will see you in the next video.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face, tell me that you love me, even if it's fake.